opportunity to talk to you guys today. The topic of our talk today is IoT from an attacker's perspective. Today's talk is structured in a way to show you guys what IoT looks like from an attacker's point of view. Let me start off by giving you a quick introduction of myself. I have been performing penetration tests for quite a few years now, and I have carried out a variety of engagements across the globe. I currently am a member of ECSA Review Board and ECSA Scheme Committee. I also hold ECSA V9 and OSCP certifications. The kind of engagements that I carry out on a daily basis include web application, mobile application, and network pen tests, along with source code reviews. I have also indulged myself in researching vulnerabilities in Linux kernels and a variety of container technologies. I was intrigued by IoT and the underlying concept, and I've started venturing into IoT and embedded software in the recent past. The agenda of our talk today is to show you guys what IoT is and also take a look at the underlying components. This talk will also help you guys understand the attack surface an IoT solution opens up and how an attacker would try to leverage these entry points to compromise the solution. IoT has grown pretty significantly in the past few years, and recent research shows that it could be a $7 trillion business by 2020. IoT has reached a certain maturity level where it is now being used in home automation, healthcare, transportation, and various other industries. This slide should give us an idea of the kind of connected world that we live in right now. The use of IoT in home automation means that physical things such as lights, window blinds, coffee machine, TV, refrigerator, etc., could connect with each other, could communicate with each other to perform tasks in a synchronized fashion. Example, you could create a routine where the window blinds would go up at sunrise and the TV would start playing the news and the coffee machine would start brewing your coffee while the audio system in your bedroom would start playing your favorite music. IoT has also found its way into the transport and mobility space. For instance, an automated parking system is now a thing of reality where all the driver needs to do is park his vehicle at the entrance of the garage, and the parking system would then go ahead and identify a vacant spot in the structure and park the vehicle at the allocated spot. Considering the breakthroughs we are achieving in self-driving cars, there could be a day in the near future where your car could pick you up from your home, drop you off at work, and park itself in the office building's parking structure, and later at the end of the day, take you back home all by itself without a chauffeur. Healthcare has started to apply IoT to build 24/7 patient monitoring systems where the patient does not necessarily have to stay within the hospital to get the kind of IoT is starting to see a similar kind of applications in other manufacturing industries and smart cities as well. So, what is IoT? IoT, as defined in Wikipedia, is a network of physical devices. So, these physical devices could range from home appliances such as lights, coffee machines, TVs, to vehicles, sensors such as proximity sensors, visual sensors, and actuators. So, these devices carry a potential to connect with each other and exchange data and work in tandem. In a nutshell, IoT brings a level of smartness to these physical devices, which would help you to automate mundane tasks like raising your window blinds, uh, turning on your coffee machine, driving your car to commute, hence giving you additional time and energy to invest in a more productive task. Let's now take a closer look at a typical IoT architecture. The screen shows the architecture diagram of Samsung SmartThings. This diagram shows us the various components that go into building an IoT solution. The sensors or devices collect data from the physical world and then send the collected data to a hub installed within the premises. This hub needs to speak the same language as the devices. For instance, here we could see that these devices communicate via Z-Wave and ZigBee protocols to offload data to the hub. The hub then connects to Samsung's cloud services via the home router. The cloud servers do the heavy lifting here as the connected devices often lack the required processing power. An IoT solution usually comes with a smartphone app to help the user set up and control the device, while the cloud servers take up the tasks such as onboarding of the device, authenticating services, and processing of the voice commands. Third-party interaction is pivotal for cross-platform applications. From this diagram, we can see that Samsung smart home devices could be controlled through the Samsung app, Google Home, or Amazon Alexa. The commands sent via these third-party controllers are routed through the SmartThing cloud servers to the Samsung hub after checking the authenticity of the connection, which then issues the command to the connected device. This is only possible because Samsung, Google, and Amazon chose to share data with each other through APIs. As we saw in the previous slide, an IoT solution typically consists of these components shown in the figure. Hardware devices would require to run some toned down version of an operating system in order to equip the device with connectivity from a software standpoint. The solution usually comes bundled with a mobile application or a web application to set up and control the device. The hub, as discussed in the previous slide, would be installed in the home network within the premises. Network is fundamental to establish connectivity between the things. Majority of the devices connect with each other via some kind of wireless protocol such as Wi-Fi, Z-Wave, Zigbee, Bluetooth, etc. While the hubs and certain devices could also be connected to the home network via Ethernet cables. The cloud infrastructure of any IoT solution is the backbone of the setup. Moving on to the security aspect of IoT, confidentiality, integrity, and availability are considered to be the three most crucial components of IoT security. Confidentiality is the state of being secret, meaning the data in transit and the data at rest are required to be protected from attackers at all times. Integrity is the state of being unmodified by unauthorized entities. Integrity checks ensure that the smart devices are controlled only by the product owners. Availability is the state of being available to authorized individuals. So all the smart devices in our lives don't hold much of a value if they don't respond to our commands today. IoT typically includes three attack vectors: physical, local network, and remote. Physical attacks require the attacker to have physical access to the device in order to carry out these attacks. Such attacks include leveraging the debug ports on the device to gain root shell of the device. Local attacks are carried out by the attacker from the local area network to which the smart devices are connected. Such attacks involve the attacker sniffing the packets sent back and forth from the connected devices to perform replay attacks and man in the middle kind of an attack. Remote attacks are the holy grail of attacks, where the attacker is able to control the smart devices from a remote location which could be halfway across the globe. IoT opens up a huge attack surface which an attacker could leverage to eavesdrop and monitor victims, control their security devices such as cameras and smart locks and etc. The compromised network could also be used to carry out illegal cyber activities. Introduction of IoT in smart homes mean we have a significantly higher amount of home devices being connected to the internet. This may include refrigerators, coffee machines, washers, dryers, and automobiles, which could never have been an entry point for an attacker. Due to the sheer number of connected devices and the origin of such devices, it is quite common for consumers to not update their device softwares or firmwares to the latest version. It is also quite possible for consumers to install inexpensive devices from untrustworthy vendors who could have backdoor accounts set up to connect to the devices remotely, mishandle the consumer data, or simply stop providing security updates, leaving the device and the network it is connected to highly vulnerable to cyber attacks. The attack surface of an IoT solution includes the hardware of the device, the firmware of the device, the device's memory, the device's local storage, the operating system, and the Linux kernel that the device might be running on, the software update mechanism, the communication network, the web interface, mobile application, the cloud infrastructure, and third-party interactions. Let's take a closer look at each of these attack surfaces in the upcoming slides. A device or a thing, as explained in the previous slides, could be an embedded device, a sensor, or a hub connected to the IoT network. Devices, sensors, and actuators collect data from the physical world as well as act upon receiving commands. Sensors play a key role in setting up routines and automation, including adjusting the thermostat based on the data received from the temperature sensors, turning the lights and TV on or off, or even trigger the security alarm in an event of intrusion, which could be detected with the help of data provided by the motion sensors. Hubs act as data aggregators where they collect data from these devices and route them to the cloud servers for data processing. Hubs are also responsible for sending signals back to the right device based on the commands issued by the user. The common entry points leveraged by an attacker to penetrate into an IoT solutions are debug ports such as JTAG, UART, SPI, and I2C. The entry points could also include vulnerable services running on the device and the lack of TLS during communication and the missing of security patches. IoT devices often ship with Linux kernel and operating systems, including utilities such as BusyBox. While these are quite useful for developing and playing around with the hardware, they should not be made available on production systems where the shell access is seldom required. UART interfaces, on the other hand, often enables physical attackers to access and alter the IoT devices by bypassing regular authentication mechanisms via serial connection. In addition, UART interfaces tend to grant root access to the users far exceeding the permissions of regular users. So an attacker would typically require physical access to the device, tools such as bus parrot or jetagulator to directly interface with the device, and a laptop with debuggers, and of course lots and lots of cables. However, in a scenario where you are not able to identify UART or JTAG pins, then you might have to go ahead and solder the pins yourself onto the board, but let's not get into that right now. So there are a plethora of tools out there which could help you connect and interact with the devices directly. Let's take an example of JTagulator and see how one could use it to interact with the device's interface. So the JTagulator comes with its own terminal interface. All you need to do is identify the UART pins properly and connect them to the JTagulator, which would in turn connect to your computer. Then you need to key in the voltage rating of the device, the baud rate, and the channel used for communication. So the JTagulator could also attempt to identify these values for you, making your life easier. Once everything is set up, all you need to do is enter the pass-through mode from the JTagulator, and now you could directly communicate with the device. At this point, some devices may provide you with the root shell, while you need to wiggle your way into the root shell for other devices. This attack could also be performed using multiple other devices and not necessarily have to be performed using the JTagulator. Let's dive into what an attacker usually looks for in a device's hardware. The attacker's primary focus here would be to gain root access to the device. Some devices directly boot into a root shell without prompting for a password while you drop into a UART shell. Certain devices could let you reset the root password if you are logging into the device's interface for the first time, while the others could have default or blank root passwords. Root passwords could also be stored in the device's local storage or the firmware, which the attacker could then use to get into the root shell. A couple of years back, a research team disclosed a vulnerability in a smart lighting solution. The device shipped with an open U-boot installation, meaning that with the UART adapter hooked up, the attacker could have access to modify the default boot parameters. This opened up the device to an attack technique called kernel init hijacking. So this technique involves modifying the init boot argument, which when passed to the kernel specifies which script will handle the boot up process after the kernel is loaded. By modifying this parameter, the attacker could control the kernel to drop into a shell over UART. This allows the attacker temporary root access to the file system. So this device also started SSH servers upon device boot up. So the attacker could use this root shell access to crack the root password. This root password could then be used to connect to the device via SSH and gain root shell access. A similar kind of vulnerability was identified in a smart hub, where the attacker would short out the data pins on the NAND while the kernel is being read from the NAND flash by the bootloader. This causes the U-boot to drop into an interactive shell over UART, since a valid kernel could not be read. The bootloader will default into an insecure configuration mode. From here, the attacker could alter the kernel arguments, resulting in the device being booted into a root shell. The attacker would also attempt to extract the firmware from the device and perform modifications and try to flash the malicious firmware back to the device. The attacker would also be on the lookout for misconfigured or vulnerable services, as we discussed in the previous scenario. Firmware is a great way to gain information about the operating system, the file system, and the services running on the device, along with the version numbers. Firmware could be obtained by the attacker in a number of ways. So the attacker could just dump the firmware from the device itself by connecting to it via a serial connection. The firmware could also be downloaded from the update repositories. Another non-traditional way to get your hands on the firmware is to sniff out or capture the firmware while it is being sent to the device via over-the-air updates. Here are some tools that an attacker would require to analyze the firmware. Strings is a simple tool which an attacker could use to get a list of readable strings from the firmware bin file. The string dump may contain the password of the device's user account. Binwalk is another interesting tool which could be used to extract the file system from the firmware. The attacker could then traverse through the file system to look for vulnerable services, insecure file and folder permissions as well. The attacker would also attempt to modify the firmware by including backdoor access to the device and flash it back on the device. In an event that the device does not check for signatures prior flashing the firmware, the attacker now has an exploit technique which could be used against the devices installed globally. First thing that an attacker checks for in a device firmware is to see if the firmware dumped from the device is encrypted or not. If the firmware is not encrypted, then it opens up a lot of possibilities. So as discussed earlier, the firmware is a great source to obtain sensitive information such as hard-coded credentials, encryption algorithms, and cryptographic secrets. The firmware could also include certain sensitive URLs which an attacker could try to force browse from the web interface. The attacker could also get an insight on the services running on the device and check if the services are vulnerable to non-exploits. These services could also be checked for security misconfigurations. The firmwares could also contain executables which the attacker could then analyze to identify for issues such as buffer overflow, which could result in remote code execution. Insecure data storage is a huge security concern in IoT as well. Similar to mobile applications, IoT applications could also store unencrypted sensitive information such as the user credentials, PII, cryptographic keys, etc. in the local flash storage or the external SD cards. In some cases, the devices may initially download the firmware updates onto the SD cards from the internet and then install it onto the device. An attacker could potentially swap this firmware update with a malicious update and then trick the device to install the attacker's firmware. Flash storage and SD cards may also contain the configuration files with insecure file and folder permissions. An attacker with a non-root shell access could then leverage this to modify such files to elevate their privileges or compromise the system with just the privileges that they have. In the previous slides, we talked a great deal about hardware security. I would like to emphasize that although hardware is a significant attack surface, IoT security extends to other areas as well, which we will be covering in the upcoming slides. With the rapidly growing IoT industry and a lack of standardization in the operating systems that each device use, uh, OEMs started to develop their own custom operating systems. OpenWRT, Contiki, FreeRTOS, TinyOS are a few such IoT operating systems. To fit in the small footprint of the device, security often takes the backseat while such new operating systems are being developed. A recent attack targeting IoT devices named Mirai was caused due to the exploitation of a known vulnerability in the operating systems used by dozens of closed-circuit TV cameras and DVRs. Mirai is a malicious program that replicates itself by finding, attacking, and infecting vulnerable IoT devices. It is considered to be a botnet because the infected devices are controlled via a central set of command and control servers. These servers tell the infected devices which sites to attack. Mirai botnet was used to carry out distributed denial of service attacks against OVH and DIN with traffic reaching a staggering 620 gigabit per second. Kernel is an equally important entity to be checked for security gaps. You could use a kernel system call fuzzers such as a syscaller to identify flaws in the kernel and write an exploit code for the identified vulnerabilities. Software update mechanism is an interesting area to focus while evaluating the security of an IoT solution. Devices usually receive firmware or software updates from the vendor in an over-the-air fashion. Such an update mechanism involves the device downloading the update from the internet. An attacker could attempt to perform a man-in-the-middle attack and push a malicious update onto the device if the updates are pushed over insecure connections or misconfigured TLS implementation. Some devices require the user to update the devices via a USB drive or their mobile application. Attackers could plug in a USB device with malicious software update and then trick the device to install the update if the device does not validate the integrity and authenticity of the update. Typical communication protocols include Wi-Fi, Ethernet, Zigbee, Z-Wave, Bluetooth, NFC, MQTT, radio frequency, REST, cellular, etc. The network packets can be captured using tools such as HackRF1, Ubertooth1, Bluetooth Sniffer, and Alpha Wireless cards. So, from the software standpoint, Wireshark could be used to capture the packets being transmitted in the network, and the same tool could be used to analyze the captured packets for sensitive unencrypted data. The communication within the IoT ecosystem may be insecure if attackers are able to sniff, analyze, replay, and extract sensitive information from the communication. Since IoT is a new and evolving technology, many IoT protocols do not define proper security mechanisms, and vendors might implement default insecure modes. A Bluetooth smart bulb was compromised recently in a similar fashion due to insecure communication. This bulb receives GAT commands and requests. The attacker captured the HCI log from the mobile device which was used to communicate with the smart bulb. Upon opening this log file in Wireshark, the attacker could see all the requests made to the smart bulb. With enough data in hand, the attacker could understand which request does what and could replay these packets in order to turn the light on or off, and could also change the color of the light. So the attacker generally looks for unencrypted data transmitted in the network and analyze the packets to obtain sensitive or any useful information that the attacker could use against the device. Web and mobile interface play a key role in controlling the IoT devices and hence are needed to be free from vulnerabilities. Web and mobile applications have been out there for quite a few years now and are in a relatively mature state. These applications tend to get the kind of attention they need to get from a security standpoint. However, this may not be the case when it comes to the web or mobile interface of an IoT solution. Due to the maturity of web and mobile technologies, we already have an extensive list of common vulnerabilities which affect such systems. Plugging these security gaps would significantly improve the security of an IoT solution as a whole. So an attacker usually looks for uh, any default credentials and also looks for parameters which might be vulnerable for injection attacks and cross-site scripting attacks. The attacker would also look for authentication pages where he could go ahead and perform brute force attacks to brute force his way through the account. In the past, a baby monitoring system was affected by a insecure direct object reference vulnerability by which any authenticated user via their cloud service could view the camera details for any other user, including the video recording details. Another attack was carried out by exploiting cross-site scripting vulnerability. So, a web service used on the backend of a smart device, cloud service to create remote streaming sessions was vulnerable to reflected and stored cross-site scripting. Subsequently, session hijacking was possible due to the lack of HTTP only flag. So, an attacker could hijack a victim session and eavesdrop on their streaming sessions. SQL injections have been prevalent in the web application space for a long time now. A Smart Hub was running a PHP application on the device, which was found to be vulnerable to SQL injection. Attackers could leverage this vulnerability to create a PHP shell and upload it. Later, use the web interface to execute commands via the uploaded PHP shell. The fun fact here is the shell obtained in this case had root privileges. Companies need to invest time to secure the cloud backend of their IoT solutions as well. The cloud infrastructure needs to go through security audits in regular intervals in order to ensure proper key management, installation of security updates, removal of unused user accounts, and ensuring proper configuration of cloud instances so that the client data is not available to unauthorized personnel. In case of a multi-tenant architecture, the product architects should ensure proper isolation of multi-tenant data. As discussed in our initial slides, third-party interaction has become quite common to support cross-platform applications. This means the opening up of your data stores to a third party. Such data shared mutually between two parties should be restricted in a need-to-know basis. Improper configuration of third-party integration might result in unintentional data leaks. Use of compromised third-party services might result in the compromise of confidentiality and integrity of customer data. Source code review is a great way to identify and fix security issues. A well-versed programmer with the right security knowledge could potentially identify a great deal of vulnerabilities just by looking at the source code. Due to the large lines of code that is required to drive IoT solutions, code analysis tools could be used to eliminate low-hanging issues. I would like to end today's talk by reiterating the fact that security is not a step, but a process. New vulnerabilities are discovered every day and security updates are released to fix these issues. Customers should take the responsibility and go ahead and install these security updates as soon as they are released on all the connected devices that they may own and use. I would like to thank each of you for choosing to attend this talk and sticking with me till the end. I would like to open up the session for questions now. If you like to take any questions offline, feel free to contact me via LinkedIn or tweet to me. Thank you.